Good morning. And now it's really dark. Still working on that plan of finding somewhere better and a better time of day to make these videos. I'll figure something out. So, I thought I'd talk to you guys about bugs and the benefits that at least I think you will have from using functional programming in a test-driven development fashion. So, let's start by saying that one of the worst things about object-oriented programming, in my opinion, like there's a lot of things that I'm not so a big fan of, and there are some things that I really like. But one of the things I really dislike is that whenever you want to do, for the most part, test-driven development with an object-oriented code base, you will see that there is a lot of energy and a lot of boilerplate that you're going to have to put into instantiating objects, because usually what happens is that as time moves along, people will inevitably start creating assumptions about field variables inside of an object, so that in order to actually be able to run a certain piece of logic or a certain piece of code, they're creating, without thinking about it, a sequence of events or a sequence of instantiations that needs to take place in order for you to do something. Now this is really bad, because what usually happens is that all of a sudden I'm here trying to test my little method that I added to this object, and in order to do that I actually have to create a constructor, and I need to add all the dependencies that the object needs, even though it has absolutely nothing to do, for the most part, with what I want to do. It's completely unrelated, and you'll very quickly see that, especially for the larger domain objects, which for the most part are payments and so forth, you'll see that all of a sudden you have 50 lines of code of mocking and stubbing and all that other bullshit in order to even be able to test the thing that you want to test. Now, the closest thing to a solution to this problem, and I really think that this is one of the main reasons why functional programming has become popularized, at least for the test-driven development communities. And that is that if you have a functional approach to solving your problem, then you should at no point find yourself stubbing and mocking a bunch of prerequisite stuff that you need in order to run your function. Now, there is an exception to this, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, but the idea being that if the majority of your code is built using pure functions, then you can never get into a situation where one function or one piece of code needs to execute before the next piece, because you can at any time instantiate, or rather run your code using whatever input data that you want. And if you've done it correctly, you should have the most isolated small piece of, like, a function is literally the lowest level abstraction that you can have. Like, there's nothing smaller. Now, why is this important? Well, it is important because from a testability standpoint, this means that you can reduce conceptually your code down to two parts. Always. And this is the way that I look at it, is that you can have code that acts as a data stream or a data provider. This is usually a connection to a database or an AJAX call or an HTTP call, whatever. You can, and that's what we call an impurity. So that's one part of the code. And then you have business logic code, which is where your functions are like pure functions that do some type of data transformation on that code, or that data that you're going to get, or whatever for the most part, you're going to get data from the data sources. And if you separate these two, if you never mix them, and you think about, in my opinion, it's basically like the flow usually goes, you make an AJAX call, or you get some data from a data source, you have your data in an object or a structure or a strut or whatever you want. You pipe that through your magic function that is supposed to do the business logic, and out on the other side comes the results of that computation, and then you either send that to your client or you send it back to a data source like the database or something like that. If that's your workflow, then the only time you have the bug, in theory, the amount of bugs that you will have is really only scoped to that middle part, that piece of business logic that you have. You have no dependencies on anything, because if you think about it, if you just have that function, it doesn't matter where you're getting your data. It can be anything. I mean, the function itself, it doesn't care if it's an AJAX call or it's a database, or even if you have a file on the file system. The data is just data. And what's beautiful about that is that from a testability standpoint, you don't have to mock any HTTP requests. You never have to stub anything at all. None of that matters whatsoever, because all you're doing is piping. You're putting an input to a function, and outcome on the other side, something else happens. Now, the exception to this rule, which you will see happen quite a bit, is when you have a sequence of, when there's a lot of I/O stuff, a lot of database access, a lot of stuff that is going on, where you may need to do some stubbing and mocking and so forth, where you're not actually doing unit tests anymore, you're doing integration tests, and that's a different matter. Integration tests are usually, they require you to do more work. Now, I personally will tell you this, I think that integration tests are good in a way, like they are good, but they get very quickly, they get into a situation where it becomes very hard to maintain them. I honestly believe that, well, this is at least my approach. What I think is a better way to do it than doing integration tests is that if you have a pure functional approach to your business logic, you'd use unit tests to make sure that the data that you're providing to your function is going to produce the expected results. And then in your actual runtime, your application, you make sure that you log all data you're sending to an external database or an external service, or you're getting from a service, so that you can manually, like in production, make sure that your logs are showing you, oh, you're getting the expected data. And then you don't have to go crazy with the integration test, because honestly, your integration test will give you, if the interfaces for the data streams ever change, the integration test will all be wrong, and they have because there's no connection between that data source in reality and your application. So there's no dependency. If one changes, the other doesn't get updated. So anywho, that's my opinions about that. So yeah.